Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Payments Association. The title of today's webinar is AI in Payments. That's tackling fraud, strengthening compliance and driving efficiency. I'm Matt Clare, VP of Fraud and 3D Secure Operations at Thread. Before we start, just a few quick points so you can get the most out of today. Captions are available for this webinar, and you can turn those on using the button on the control panel at the bottom of your screen. You'll also see a Q&A tab on your control panel. Please do submit questions for the speakers today at any time during the session. We'll come to those at the end. And you can ask questions anonymously if you prefer. We will get to as many questions as we can during the session. If you do have any technical issues, please send a message in the chat box to Christina Gatens, and she'll try and help from the Payments Association. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll receive a link to watch it on demand within the next 2 days. That will be in an email from the Payments Association. Just before the panel starts, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Shashank Arora from Sion, who's going to spend a few minutes giving us a demo of how Sion uses AI to detect fraud by analyzing digital footprints and behavior in real time. Over to you, Shashank.
Thank you, Matt. Pleasure meeting everyone today. So let me bring up my screen. And yes, so you should be able to see my screen. So the way the Sion solution works is, or what the demo today is looking at the user details across the entire life cycle of the user journey, beginning from the time that they register with a fintech or a payment services solution. And here with Sion's solution, what I'll be able to demo is how we can create holistic user profile and then look at the data using Sion's proprietary device intelligence solution, data enrichment checks, and then combining these with white box machine learning rules. So for the purpose of demonstration today, I am looking at a registration check where I'll be leveraging the email address, the phone number that are collected explicitly from the user, and while implicitly collecting the device details as well as the IP address from where the user is accessing the system. For the purpose of the presentation today, I am simulating a scenario where somebody is trying to register with Sion. When the user comes to the Sion page, what Sion will provide, or what the solution provides you with, is the capability of device intelligence. A simple JavaScript sits within the customer's page, and through that JavaScript, we are able to read information around aspects around the device, the screen resolution, the cookie preferences, is the user using a VPN or a proxy, and other additional device details. Here in this case, the Sion intelligence solution has loaded, a device intelligence solution has loaded, and we have initialized the data collection for the device. There are different configurable attributes that are available, but I'll cover these when we come to the end of the demo. So here, what I'm simulating is the user is trying to create user details. I want to create a scenario or present a scenario of fraudulent activity. For that, what I'll be doing is simulating a scenario where user has shared the credentials or is trying to create fraudulent accounts. So for that, I'll be copy and pasting the details of the user in the platform to show how the device intelligence solution would be able to track if the user has used a copy paste functionality, which can be an indicator for synthetic accounts that are being created. So the user details are being copied and pasted in the system. The date of birth remains the same and password. Continue this. As you can see, while I did that, the solution was able to capture the details within the fingerprint session of the user. I'll just edit further details here, and then we should be good to go. And this should be Manhattan. Yes. So now what data points I will looking at is we've entered the email address and the phone number on the previous page. So on the basis of those data points, the solution would be leveraging the data across 250 plus social and digital services. Combine that with the user's intent or the how the data has been seen on the network of customers before. Has there any like, is this account been previously created, or has this been freshly created just for the purpose of fraudulent activity? The device intelligence solution looked at or collected the data from the device, looking at various signals where I was accessing from. Am I using a VPN or a proxy? And then also looking at the behavioral biometric data. Like, did I use copy paste? Was there any suspicious keystroke rate that I represented? Did I move the mouse very fast? Did I move the mouse at all? Looking at all those human-like or bot-like behaviors and then returning those in the suspicious flags within the response of the solution. And all of this data is then combined together, used together with the machine learning white box rules to present you a final fraud score or the risk score, which can then be used to identify and make a decision whether this activity looks suspicious or not. When I click this, the system is creating an account and the account is blocked. The response is instantaneous. As you can see, what has happened here is the solution came back with a fraud score of 60 for the user. The details of the checks have been highlighted here. And when we look at the details, what the system did was an out-of-the-box configuration saying that this transaction is to be declined. The phone number came back with a score of 63. This is the network score. Basically, has this phone number been seen before? Or is this phone number risky in first place? Has this email been seen before? If yes, has this email been part of any suspicious activity on Seon's network? If this email has been seen before with any of the customers of Seon, yes, this was seen 30 times. And out of those 30 times, 3 times this email was part of any fraudulent activity. So this was around the details from the email. But what we were also able to do very efficiently is look at the details from the device and other attributes and then present a holistic response saying more than one user used the same password and IP address within the last 24 hours. There were multiple registrations from the same IP address and same device. So we were able to identify the device and then we've given that. And the user's location did not match with the IP-based geolocation. So the user is using an IP address, which probably is an IP in the US, but the user is based in the UK. And as I said, I am using a VPN provided by my organization, and I did copy paste. The system identified those and then accordingly have given relevant flags identifying that this was a synthetic ID scenario where copy paste or a VPN or a proxy was being used.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Shashank. Very useful, and obviously people can reach out to you directly with any questions. We're now going to move on to the panel. So each of the panel members will introduce themselves and then we'll move on to today's questions. And again, you can send us questions during the webinar. So I'll start with Ash, please.
Hi, it's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Ash. So I run business banking financial crime at Monzo, and I also run FinCrime for our European Union expansion. So hopefully it can be useful in more than one jurisdiction.
Alex.
Very good. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Alex West. I lead the banking and payments fraud practice at PwC in the UK. So I advise banks and payment firms on how to protect themselves and their customers from fraud.
Thank you. David.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Sutton, and I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Featurespace, a Visa solution. At Featurespace, I look after our innovation lab, which looks to leverage AI to better build anti-fraud products for financial institutions. I was previously an astronomer, but have been at Featurespace for 10 years. I'm also a fellow at Hughes Hall at Cambridge.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Gareth, finally.
Thanks very much. So I'm heading up investigations and intelligence for the new domestic corruption unit housed within the City of London Police. We're focused on building new anti-bribery corruption capability across the UK, but particularly looking at economic crime and professional enablers. I've worked in all sorts of areas in policing, but very much specialise in fraud and financial crime, and now obviously bribery and corruption.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So today's first question. What does today's fraud landscape look like, and how are criminals using AI and other technologies to target consumers and business? David, I think you're going to lead on this, followed by Gareth.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so I think this is something that can sometimes be quite tricky to understand in a kind of systematic way, the way that the bad guys are using AI to kind of automate scams or to make their ability to conduct fraud better. There obviously are some high-profile cases of things like real-time deepfakes, and those are very obvious to the victim when they've happened. So that sort of modus operandi really kind of stands out. In particular, there was a confirmed case confirmed by the Hong Kong police in February 2024, where a multinational, one of their finance workers was induced to send $25 million to a fraud account, and they lost the money on the basis of a deep-faked call purporting to be from their CFO. So with cases like that, I mean, it's great that the police have confirmed that, so we know it's an issue, but it also, I guess, advertises to the bad guys that this technology can be used to great effect. And we've also seen examples of various well-established scam organizations, groups like the Yahoo Boys, basically bragging about using real-time deepfakes and showing videos of themselves scamming unsuspecting victims as well. So I think that use of technology is absolutely certain, and it's here now, and it's been here for more than a year. So that's a reality. I think there's also more circumstantial evidence for the use of large language models to better hone the kind of quality of communications that go out to people, and to make scams more effective. The best systematic study I've seen for this was actually really recently, so this is a really well-timed seminar. And this was from the Turing Institute, and it was released last week, and it was called Automating Deception. And they were looking at trying to red team this. So they're trying to think like scammers and use all of the technology that's there and available at the moment to see what they could do with it, and to really sort of put it through its paces and to evaluate. And it's a systematic study by scientists, so it's really well done. Definitely recommend reading it. And they kind of found two things that really stuck with me. And the first was that the LLMs are really good at automating the initial contact part of the process. So if you like, when you're trawling for victims, and that could be used to scale things up. And I think that chimes with some reports we've had from cybersecurity firms that since ChatGPT and the like were launched in late 2022, we've seen huge spikes and increases in the number of phishing messages, and kind of phishing and automated messaging to start scams are very similar, and it's the same people in the ecosystem doing it. But what was also interesting is that the study found that as conversations got longer, the quality of the scam conversation coming from the automated agent really kind of fell off a cliff. They started forgetting things it had established, things it had claimed, things that the other party had said. So it became a lot less believable. And so from this, I think we'd have to infer that you can't automate the whole process. You can automate the start, but what you do once you have found a victim and you're in that more kind of spear phishing phase where you're grooming them, is to use LLMs to make your human communication better. So kind of trivial things like grammar and rewrite this in a more persuasive way. which I'm sure we all use in our day-to-day lives for non-nefarious reasons. But you can also do things like psychological profiling based on what we know. What do you think would be the most effective and persuasive thing to persuade this person?
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, David. And Gareth, from your perspective in the police, where do you see the landscape currently, and what technologies criminals are using to target people?
Yeah, thank you. So fraud is sitting at about 40% of all crime in the UK. So it's a huge threat. Some of it undoubtedly is quite sophisticated, like those CEO frauds and so forth. But actually, a very large percentage of it is fire and forget type spam attacks, which, as David was saying, are historically relatively poor, but actually with the use of AI tools can become much more compelling quite easily. And I think of the AI threat in fraud is coming to two broad buckets. And one is new avenues of exploitation, new attack vectors using new technologies like the deep fake and the voice mimicking. And the other is those tools being used to make frauds better and easier for criminals. An example was, and you couldn't make it up, but I got a fraud call come through to me less than 2 hours ago. It was on a mobile phone. It had a really bad old-fashioned robot voice, and it got as far as saying, Her Majesty's revenue and I put the phone down. So had that been a human-like voice, it only really takes 1% more people to listen to the pitch and press a link, and suddenly you've got a huge loss of money. And I think that's a real threat. I think the other element that I think is emerging with AI is it being used not so much for the scam itself, but as a support mechanism in the form of social manipulation. A lot of scams are propagated on social media, where popularity and the weight of popular support are really powerful. People look at how many clicks there are, how many followers there are, and the use of AI bots to add those clicks, the likes, to populate chat rooms and things, I think adds a level of legitimacy to content creators who are there to get a following before then diverting across to scams. So I think that's a bit of a hidden danger. And just to kind of give a little bit of a flavour of what it is that we're sort of seeing coming in terms of fraud reporting linked to AI. And of course, some of it you're not going to know is AI, but some of those that are a bit more overt. So celebrity impersonation. Again, this comes back to that sort of deep fake. And we're seeing this in two areas really. One of them is advanced fee scams, which is the traditional, my money is locked up in wherever, can you help me? But obviously with a new spin. And also romance frauds as well. So the use of fake celebrity identities to try and build relationships with people, or the use of celebrity-like faces to do it. So it's being used in different ways. Third, fraudulent services and documentation. So with this, you're thinking about invoice fraud and the sort of CEO fraud that David mentioned. Romance fraud, I've mentioned. Again, adding a fake face. Before the fraudster would have to, show their face on camera, have their voice potentially being recorded. Now they don't need to. So that's given them a level of anonymity, which makes it hard for law enforcement to chase. Hello Mum, which most people have seen in the news, faking the voice of a child, which usually the voice clip has been captured online or on social media and is then being used and manipulated, and basically get to a situation where they can have that child saying anything, and of course they're asking for money. And then you've got sextortion, use in biometrics and KYC. So it's being, it's turning up in all sorts of different areas. I think that the uses for AI as a threat are as broad as the criminals are imaginative, and unfortunately they're pretty imaginative.
Thank you, Gareth. Alex, I know you've done some work with Stop Scams. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think David and Gareth have got the points spot on, and across the different threat types, and particularly on some of the more celebrated cases. I think the research we did with Stop Scams was about a year and a half ago now, and that looked across the industry at what banks were seeing coming through in terms of fraud cases which involved an element of AI. The punchline to a lot of that was sometimes, or most of the time, in fact, it's very, very hard to tell. So clearly in some of the cases that David's referenced and that Gareth has referenced, that it's a deep fake, it's a voice clone, that perhaps it's much easier to say that a criminal's made use of AI. But as David said, that undercurrent of use of AI, just as we're all using ChatGPT to improve our work, the underlying use of that to improve the believability, to increase the sophistication of a scam, and just to push out greater volume. I think that's what we were hearing from industry then and now, that AI will primarily be about. It's about amplification of fraudsters' ability to reach people with more sophisticated threats. I think the one other thing I'd reference, which I think is a helpful sort of way of talking about this, is Interpol's definition of synthetic media types, which, and I think they produced a report about a year ago looking at how synthetic media is being used by criminals. They talk about 4 broad categories. One around synthetic audio, so voice clones, which could be used, as the guys have already said, to dupe someone as a scam or to penetrate a biometric security feature potentially. Deepfake video, as has already been said, lots of celebrity impersonation scams, but increasingly we're seeing that being deployed in things like romance scams on a much more targeted basis. Generated text, so improving the quality of phishing, smishing has already been said. And the final one, which hasn't come up, is synthetic ID. So how do you use an AI to generate identification documents and the legend that sits around you that makes you look like a real person? So that's a helpful way of thinking about the categories, I think.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Ash, anything you'd like to add on this subject from your perspective, heading up fraud for a very large player?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we notice a lot is that frauds have started to compound. So as these organizations have become more industrialized and find efficiencies within their own methods of committing these frauds, we often find that something like a ticket scam, which is particularly popular in the summertime, we might find that the victim of a fraud is directed to a website where they have to input all their information. And of course, they never get their ticket. But then several months later, they're also subject to, a more in-depth type of romance scam or your advance fee type fraud, which can be really frustrating. And so that compound notion of how we scam in multiple ways has really become industrialized over the last couple of years, which is really concerning. And I have no doubt that AI is playing its role in introducing that level of efficiency.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ash. And I know also from our perspective, Thread as a processor, a couple of clients have mentioned to us that they've seen adverts on some social media platforms actually asking to buy accounts. So a legitimate account can be bought and then used either as money mules or for other purposes. Let's move on to another question. So can you share a compelling success story where AI has effectively stopped fraud or strengthened efficiency? I'm going to go to Alex first, please.
Yeah, so this isn't really a story of a single case, but I think it's sort of, there are 3 broad categories where AI can really be powerful in a counter fraud world. I think the first one is around improved detection accuracy. So using machine learning, model-driven detection approaches, which the industry has been doing for a long time, but with increasingly greater reliance on model-based approaches. So better detection accuracy, pushing down false positives, allowing you to really identify the payments that look actually to be genuinely suspicious. And we're seeing the use of large transaction models, embeddings into those models to improve the efficiency again, and that's really sort of cutting edge. The second category, I think, where AI can potentially be very powerful is around disrupting criminality. So you'd have seen like the AI Granny, Daisy, Stop Scams UK had a project called Project Trojan, where they were looking to use AI to actually engage with scammers and to capture intelligence. I think we're going to see more of that use of AI to actually go on the offensive, waste scammers' time. That I think is a really interesting application for this technology. The third, which is perhaps sometimes I think overlooked and perhaps the least exciting, but probably generates the biggest bang for buck in a big bank, is operational efficiency. So where can you use AI to streamline manual processes, take people away from call centers so they're talking to a virtual agent? You take all of that saved money and reinvest back in new capability, new technology, interventions in different types of payments. I think that will deliver the greatest value and the greatest fraud capability, because a lot of this, particularly with authorized fraud and scams, it's quite hard to do purely on a digital basis. You do need people talking to potential victims and talking them to break the spell. So that freeing up that that resource, freeing up that money to reinvest in more interventions like that. I think very powerful.
Brilliant, thank you. Just before I go to David, you mentioned Daisy from one of the telcos, I forget which one. And as David was mentioning earlier, the longer you continue to engage the fraudster or the bot in a dialogue, the more likely they are to go off dialogue. If anyone hasn't seen Daisy yet, look Daisy up, as there are recordings of some of these scammers getting very, very frustrated and really being quite rude. But of course, Daisy is not a human being. Daisy is an AI bot. And not only is Daisy tying these people up, but clearly tripping them up as well, which is wonderful. David, I know you've got a slide for us in a moment, and
Yeah, I
something
do.
personal experience of. So over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Alex mentioned that detection is one of the big use cases for AI to prevent fraud, and this is something that Featurespace has been doing for years. So I can share a really recent example. Here we were doing a live pilot. So this is a live model actually operating in real time. It's not a paper model, but it was a model using our most modern deep neural network technology. So it sort of ran alongside the incumbent model that the bank had, and provided significant improvements in detection quality, which can either be cashed in as a benefit in fraud catch, where you increase the value or volume of fraud that you're catching, or you can say, actually, I'm okay with the amount of fraud I'm catching. I'm doing my job okay. I just I like it to do it more efficiently. In which case, in this example, we saw a 76% decrease in the decline rate if you match that value detection rate. And then obviously there's a whole continuum of trade-offs along that purple line that the organization can choose from and adapt to as the sort of requirements and operational realities change and evolve. Alex also mentioned large transaction models, and this is something we've spent a lot of effort on in Featurespace over the last couple of years. And we used one of these in a proof of concept with PayUK. It wasn't a live proof of concept. That was a kind of paper exercise using historic data. But there we were able to improve the catch rate of our kind of top of the line deep learning models from 43% to 56% at 5 to 1. And that was using the embeddings from the large transaction model to better inform these algorithms. So I think there's a real theme here that AI and machine learning can do better than rules, but modern AI and machine learning can do better than the more traditional systems that organizations have had in place for sort of five plus years. Outside of fraud modeling, there's a couple of other things that I don't think we've touched upon yet. And one is work being done by telcos and big tech companies to try and disrupt earlier in the kill chain. There's a wonderful feature that has come into the Pixel 6 operating system from Google. It's only available in North America at the moment. You have to go in deep into the settings in order to enable it. So it's kind of really early days. But what it does is it scans the audio on your phone and then starts firing loads of notifications at you if it suspects the phone call is based on what's being said, that it's a scam. Which is a nice idea. We haven't seen how any estimates for how effective it is as a disruption point. And then finally, with social media companies, Meta has introduced its FIRE program. I had to look up what FIRE, so Fraud Intelligence Reciprocal Exchange. There we are. And that's a process whereby banks share confirmed fraud information to Meta so they can go close down like bad guy accounts. I would love to see data sharing in the other direction as well. Because as a financial institution, you've got the highest duty of care to a customer than any other business or organization that they'll be working with, except perhaps the medical doctors. We're the last point of defense for those customers. So it would be great to be able to introduce data on risk exposures seen by that customer in various platforms and sort of communications areas that they've had. You have to do that in a privacy sort of sensitive way, and there's a whole range of new technologies under the acronym PETS for privacy enhancing technologies that are emerging and will make this possible to do in a privacy preserving way. But there needs to be the will to get the big tech companies aligned with banks on that. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, David. By the way, we spoke of Daisy earlier. Daisy is from O2. So if anyone wants to look at that, Daisy is an employee in inverted commas of O2. Would you also say, David, that consortium models are helping significantly? If you're a small startup, and if I take cards, for example, you're only processing 100,000 authorizations a month, you've clearly got a narrow view. Whereas with an organization like Featurespace and competitors, there are potentially models that are being informed by billions of transactions.
Absolutely. This helps in two ways. It can help by closing the context gap by giving you information on the other side of the transaction as well. So you know all about your customer, but you don't know anything about the destination of the funds. And if you've got a consortium model where the predictions have been informed by profiling both sides of the transactions, you can know if it's a probable mule account, for example, and be more informed. That was the basis behind the PayUK POC is what they were looking to build. But it can also help in a very simple way, which is that it takes quite a lot of data to build a good machine learning model. And not all organizations have enough data that's a thing that's possible to do well or economical to do. And this is where consortium models can come in, because you can learn from other people's risk exposures, which may be quite similar to yours, to have a system that provides you something despite your own data assets maybe being quite modest.
Brilliant, thank you. Ash, what does best practice look like before a business deploys AI? And why should organizations walk before they run?
Yeah, I think I think in all the conversation about AI, it might feel a little bit overwhelming. Certainly as a risk SME rather than an engineer, I had to learn a lot about this to work out how it operates, what it can function, how it can, achieve things for us with a kind of different lens or perspective than what I would have had, say, 5 or 6 years ago. That doesn't mean that you can't be incredibly useful in the space, though. So I think at Monzo, we've had some really good learnings around how to achieve this from day one with very little experience and moving into something that's a little bit more experienced over time. So I think one of the first things would be to make sure that you've got good quality data, right? Like, as everyone else has said, without the good data, pour info in, pour info out, as the saying goes. And there is certainly an element of truth to that. So we need to find the best data we possibly can. We need to make sure that it's accessible, that it's usable, that it's not hidden in 45 different systems that don't speak to each other, which I think is probably a thing that would resonate with a lot of people. And so often some of this early work is really preparatory, and you plan for the long term with it. If you're going to work in multiple jurisdictions, you also need to make sure you can have cross-jurisdictional access and that you've done the right things to make sure that governance around that is really good. After that, I think it's necessary to have cross-functional teams, and those teams must feel safe to fail. It's not really possible to assume that everything will turn out absolutely correctly on day one. I think that's an unattainable object, and it shouldn't be the goal at all. But if we've got our data and our engineering teams and our risk SMEs combined with operations, we get the best view of different perspectives across space that help us to find the best possible outcome that we can then iterate on over time. That's a realistic outcome that we should start to aim for. It's not really feasible to get gold on day one. So we need to accept that test and learn becomes the norm. We have to iterate over time. It's not possible to do it a different way, unless you're incredibly lucky, maybe. I think another lesson that we've learned quite well is to keep good documentation. It's really helpful to be able to look back at something 18 months after you first started it. You may have had attrition in staff or turnover, or new people have arrived with new ideas, and we can't remember whether we tried that before or not. So keeping the documentation is really good. The lesson of a lifetime is always to watch the MI. Things will change and move over time, and you need to be aware that what you've built maybe doesn't account for what's emerging in the next couple of months. And so keeping on top of that is really key. But I guess overall, the kind of message for me is that this is not a new way of working. We've all done this in different ways at different times in different institutions for a very long time. So just because AI and machine learning may feel new, that doesn't mean that the skills we already have can't be transferred in order to make it work. So there's a walk before you can run, but don't get so freaked out that you don't walk at all. I don't think that's necessary either.
Thank you. And I think you're absolutely right. Some people rush into AI expecting it to solve the world. Others are terrified of it and think they don't have the intellectual capacity or it's going to steal their jobs. And it needs a midpoint or somewhere between the two, depending upon the preparedness of the business and the skills of the person. Thank you very much. Alex, you've spoken about drawing a distinction between AI and Gen AI. Would you like to share a few more insights on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose going back to your question of how do you get ready to deploy this, I think it matters what you're deploying in what use case for what purpose. And I think the way to think about AI is it's as transformative as a business saying in the 50s or 60s, how are we going to use computers? Of course, computers are pervasive across everything we do. We do everything now through a screen. And I think we're going to get, 50, 60 years time, I suspect I'll be looking back and talking to the grandkids about this period of when we started adopting AI. But my point being ready for AI really matters what you're talking about. If you're talking about using machine learning in model detection, I think Ash's points around quality data, building the transaction record, absolutely critical, because you're not going to have a good model if you don't have the data that supports the training of that model. But if you're talking about using an AI chatbot in a customer experience context as a virtual agent, that's going to be a very different preparatory journey again. And then if you're using AI as sort of a simple operational tool for your back office staff to do things a little bit better, that's going to be different all over again. So I think the risk when we talk about AI is that we make it sound monolithic, like it's one thing. AI is the equivalent of using a computer. It's going to change the way we do lots of different things. So what matters is where you're using it for what purpose and what we really mean by AI. Is it Gen AI, machine learning? So that doesn't really answer your question, but it depends is the answer, short version. Yeah.
Thank you. And David, you use an expression which I don't think we hear very often, which is you spoke of canary testing. So
yeah, absolutely. So with traditional machine learning systems, because they're automated and they operate at scale and they operate so quickly, there is you really need to understand what you're putting live, and have have a fallback plan of what happens if there are issues. One of the things that you can do, ultimately, this comes down to testing and really understanding that model. I think Ash mentioned documentation is really important and keeping that understanding fresh in the organization. When something goes live, you'll need to do shadow testing, where you've got it testing alongside whatever system it's proposing to replace, a kind of champion challenger. And then canary testing is a phase where you're being very careful and you're saying, okay, I'm just going to put 5% of transactions or 5% of my accounts through this new system, in order to have these things run alongside the trusted old thing that you're still not very happy with because you're trying to replace it. But you can see how it responds to the same events in time. And what sort of feedback mechanisms that there might be. So I think these are all really well-established processes for machine learning models, and I think they do translate over to AI agentic sort of models as well. So I'm sure at some point people will start thinking, can we automate some of our analyst casework? I think the answer is yes, and you probably can't afford not to if you want to keep competing going forward. But be circumspect about it. So shadow test it before it goes live, where you can say, well, this is what our analyst actually thought, and what did our agentic system, what would it have done before you've actually let it change the world. And then once it is live and changing the world, you want to have some analysts reviewing the actions that those agentic systems have taken, a small percentage, but it's there firstly to keep your agent skills up to date, so they could be deployed if you need them to be, but also make sure that that agentic system remains aligned. And this is a theme that you see with good machine learning systems, is ongoing monitoring. You have to keep proving that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. You don't just test it once and throw it in and say, oh, that's fine. It has to keep earning its keep.
The pandemic is a good case in point, isn't it? We've all seen graphs where behaviours changed suddenly and models had to adapt very, very quickly. Going to move on to Gareth now. Thank you, David. As we know, AI is not about replacing human analysts or human police officers in your sphere. So how do we keep the human expertise central to such complex fraud decisions, but also in other areas of our business?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. For me, the word replace is a bit of a dirty word. And I think that if firms, whether it be, banking or police forces, whatever else, thinking that zero-sum way about it's one or the other, countering fraud and financial crime, then they're going to get themselves in trouble. I don't necessarily mean with a regulator, although that could be the case. I mean more in terms of losing expertise, experience, insights that only come from seasoned professionals. If you think about anti-money laundering and SAR regimes, technology is really important. The ability to detect threats as well as reduce false positives is absolutely critical. But who is it that develops suspicion? Who puts those pieces together and generates a cohesive narrative that's useful to explain what that suspicion means, and something that's usable for law enforcement in order to take action? And that's really about experienced professionals. So I think that relationship between tools and people is absolutely the same, and I think it's absolutely vital. It's certainly the case in monitoring, detection, investigation, but it's also people who develop our understanding of risk, that informs the insights into proper governance and so forth. So, I mean, if nothing else, if you're sacking your compliance teams, you're suddenly going to have a skills black hole. You're not going to have people to promote into in order to positions where they can inform strategic decision making or organizational improvement. And those elements are absolutely critical to keep organizations ahead of criminals who are obviously ever evolving and ever growing. So for me, this is about transitioning of skills towards what a kind of a future model looks like. I think it was Andrew Marshall from HSBC did a presentation about their AI project, and central to that was developing the development of financial crime practitioners to understand how data scientists work, and conversely, data scientists to understand what the fraud and financial crime threat was, and a real meeting of minds. Now, I don't think we can expect an omnicompetent sort of compliance team who know as much about tech as they do about fraud, but having anti-fraud professionals who are able to engage with AI tools, tune them properly, engage with them meaningfully, and be able to explain the output in a way that's would be required to the FCA, for example, is absolutely critical. So I think it's an evolution of skills and understanding.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. To the panel in general, any suggestions on how we train and reskill people to make it up the value chain quickly, both in terms of AI and in terms of moving away from the very transactional aspects of the jobs which are likely to become more and more automated?
Yeah, I think it's a really good and a really big challenge, because it's a completely necessary one as we move forward and find the efficiencies, particularly in our operational spaces. We do lose some of that skill set along the way because we no longer have that sense of the fundamental where many of us, would have started in these careers in these industries many, many years ago. And so to me, I don't have an immediate answer because I'm not sure anyone does yet. But I think part of what we need to do now is sit down and start to strategize on that answer so that we can work out best practice for ourselves, rather than maybe one institution hitting gold and getting it exactly right and then not being able to share that among others. Actually, the meeting of minds point that Gareth has made would be really useful in this environment as well, where those different perspectives across tech and the business and our risk SMEs could prove really useful to help us do that strategizing in a new way, so that we're no longer seeing ourselves as vertical pillars within a business, but that we've got this shared perspective that would help us to get there. But it is necessary to start that conversation now, so that we understand in 5 to 10 years when we've hit that change, that it doesn't trip us up and doesn't cause us puzzlement at that point.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, I'd just add a couple of points to that, which is AI is great for teaching and for learning. So I think it's important that organizations do keep a body of humans who know how to do the work. An obvious role for them, as I mentioned before, is to review review some automated casework. You would hope that you can use AI agents to get rid of most of the easy stuff, and then you're just reviewing a few of those to make sure that it's aligned with your goals, and then the complex stuff goes to your human analysts, where you need the accountability and the judgment of a human. I would like to think that we can use AI systems to try and get people to a level of expertise and to support their expertise a lot more. So systems that help people learn and to be useful while they're learning, and that you don't have to do 3 months shadowing someone before you go onto the front line.
Thank you very much. And Alex, if I can come to you briefly, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing here is having access to the tools, trying them out, learning as you go, and constantly practicing, using AI in your day-to-day world where you have access to those tools. I think on the point around sort of resourcing and things, I think the bit for me, which is really interesting, is that AI really does have an opportunity to focus effort on the higher value, higher risk cases. And if you take a fraud example very specifically, as sort of David's alluded to, a good false positive rate for a detection model might be something like, David, you have a different view maybe, but 1 in 7, 1 in 10 of an alert, that would be a good false positive rate, where you've kind of got six alerts which are being worked, which aren't actually problematic. If you can bring that down by 50% by having better accuracy, think of the value uplift that the analyst has in terms of the time they're spending looking at genuine cases. So
and also in the case of card payments, it's not declined transactions.
Not declined, exactly. Yeah.
Within some cultures, we're all here in the UK, I believe, but in some cultures, like in Japan, a declined transaction is, somebody described it to me as a stain on your honor. Meanwhile, we still have to protect against fraud.
Yeah. So I think a massive uplift potentially in honing and focusing resources on things that really matter. I think longer term, will we see more automation, more sort of synthetic agents taking on more tasks in a fraud world? I think absolutely we will, because I think customer experience will demand it, because people want digital journeys. They don't want to call into call centers. So will we see a move away from lots of people in call centers to having more people training models? I think we will, but that means we all need to train ourselves up to use these things. And the comment I always make, I'm not that old, but I remember saying, even 5 years ago, oh, I'm not a technologist. I'm a fraud specialist. I'm not a technologist. I don't think it's acceptable to say that anymore in a fraud world, because we all have to be technologists, because it's all about how we integrate technology into human processes. So I think the world's just moved on. We all need to adapt to that new world.
Exactly. And I think as well, in many respects, consumers and businesses are far more aware of fraud now than they ever were. As a processor, we put many tools at our clients' fingertips for their card holders or account holders themselves, so they can block high risk merchant category codes in card terms, or point of sale modes like contactless, and all of that's helping, but we still have a further way to go. I'm going to come to Gareth. How might regulators like the FCA here in the UK approach AI in fraud prevention, especially around trust, oversight, or over-reliance?
Yeah, I'll be careful not to speak for the FCA, but I'm looking at AI tools for law enforcement, which I'm really excited about, and also speak with people in the legal system, in the court system, and in government. And I think the general approach is one of caution, but also cautious optimism. I think it's recognised that there are huge efficiency gains and capability gains, so new tools and better tools to be made. And that very often the burden of repetitive administration is what gets in the way of good decision making. And if AI tools can remove that burden and have minds focused on the real proper criminal problems, then that's a huge win for the entire system. But I do think there is a very real danger of over-reliance or putting too much trust in a black box whose processes the organisation can't explain when asked, and you could very well get asked by a regulator. And that comes back to the point I was making earlier on, I think, about the need for human experience, and that a plug and play system, it could potentially present more risk than a properly tooled and tailored system that's integrated with existing governance oversight mechanisms and so forth. I can see the assurance and oversight currently being pretty burdensome in order to satisfy regulators that you've got a grip on these things. Maybe even producing more work than the administration that's saved with the AI. But I genuinely hope that these are kind of birthing pains, and that as the use cases mature, and that regulators and courts and the justice system, all of those parts of the system, they see the consequences of AI, the benefits of AI, and also see the adjustments made over time to the inevitable errors. As Ash said, there's going to be errors. We're going to have to iterate. We're going to have to improve, and there needs to be a system-wide acceptance of that. But I think as we go through that process, there'll be a rebalancing. I think it's right that the government side of the debate offers guardrails and words of caution, but ultimately everyone wants an effective, affordable fraud prevention system. And as an end state, if AI is one of the keys towards that, then I think that's a great opportunity for us to embrace.
Thank you, Gareth. Does the panel think that it could be that regulators act with good intent? For example, we're all a little bit concerned about bias in AI models. We've seen hallucinations in AI models as well, where it does something unexpected. But you could also argue that it's up to the business to have guardrails. And if the regulator goes in too hard, then we lose some of the benefits. Do you think there's any risk of that? Or from what we're seeing from places like the EU and the small number of countries with AI regulation, do you think we're likely to be in a good place?
Shall I do the honors? Yeah, again, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I think I take the point that Gareth is making about the rebalancing, and I do think that'll happen over time for sure, as it has with everything else, right? We adopted telephones and we adopted computers, and all things go in their way, and I think this will as well. But I certainly don't think that regulators are coming to it with any sense of malice. I think in as much as we're all sitting here saying, hey, I've got stuff to learn, that's also true of our regulators. They too have stuff to learn, and they're going to need to be given the grace of time to learn it just as much as we expect the grace of their time to learn it also. And so there's a kind of shared space there that I think we could all afford to be maybe a bit kinder to one another and ourselves within. It's new. We have to learn it. Everybody else does as well. And I think that balance does come out in the wash in the middle. I also think it's possible when we get a sense of like launch fever or go fever, that we really do want to achieve something very quickly. And there is a safety and caution about that. It's the same as working in NASA. Ultimately, it's the business of saving lives. And you want to make sure that you're not causing downstream customer harm entirely by accident, born of no malice whatsoever. And until we work out the balance of where that sits, I think a little bit more caution is probably to be expected and condoned, to be honest. I would not like us to make a monumental error in multiple places at once that then causes people to lose a lot of the trust that we're cautiously sort of building over time. So I wouldn't have heavyweight criticism of it. I do think the regulators come to it with a sense of genuine like goodwill and effort, and we just need to be willing to share that space.
Exactly. And I think regulation is necessary. We can imagine an unregulated AI world, and we could see some pretty unscrupulous or discriminatory things going on. Going to come to you, Alex, briefly, but I just want to remind everyone who's watching, we have one question so far, which we will answer shortly. If anyone does want to post any other questions, you can do so anonymously. So please go ahead. Alex, let me come to you with a few points you wanted to make here.
Yes, well, Gareth wasn't going to speak for the FCA, and I'm not going to either. I think to fall back on my sort of answer from before, I think it really depends on what situation you're using and the application, and the focus, I think, for regulators will be on what's the customer outcome off the back of the application of a particular tool. So I think if you're talking about using an AI model to make decisions about loan applications, for example, in a fraud world, then clearly, testing around that to make sure that the data supports an unbiased outcome is going to be really important. And I know there are stories of models that have made bad decisions about rejecting applications from certain groups of people because a bias in underlying data set. So I think you've got to be really careful around that. But I think if there's a different application of an AI, for example, in a customer services agent mode, then perhaps there's less risk of adverse outcomes, and so you can take a more of a risk-based approach. The other bit I would say from a regulatory point of view is go back to the point I made right at the beginning. Machine learning has been around for a long time. Model-based approaches around fraud detection have been around for a long time. So that this is not necessarily completely new ground if we're talking about AI in the broad sense. I think it's when we're particularly talking about generative AI and what that means, when it feels more new and flashy and perhaps is less well integrated into the payments kind of infrastructure. Hopefully that answers some of the question, but I think there's such a wide variety of what we mean by AI and applications. All of those will have different regulatory considerations around them.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'm going to come to you with this question, but other panel members, please feel free to come in. It's from Louise Delatte, and she's asking, how do we prefer to collaborate with third parties that offer deep fake detection solutions, which were alluded to earlier? And what technological capabilities do we expect from them?
Well, that's a good question. So I think it's sort of deepfake detection, it really matters where the deepfake is pointed. So if you're thinking in a banking context, you might have deepfakes that are pointed at a voice biometric system to come through into telephone banking. You might have a deepfake that's trying to get through a liveliness check on an onboarding in a digital journey in an app. Or you might have a deepfake that's sitting on a social media platform that a customer is seeing and then being duped. So where you deploy deepfake detection across that really matters. I think there are some really interesting solutions out there, lots of innovation in this space. We get contacted a lot by different deepfake detection vendors that want to talk to us about how they can be integrated with different systems. I'll give you an example. So there's a solution out there where if you're a customer, you can take a snapshot of an advert on an online marketplace, and the tool will look at that advert, will evaluate the risk that it's a scam, and will give you a scam score based on that screenshot. So giving an AI-powered tool into the hands of a customer to help them make a good choice. That's a good example. Or all the voice biometric systems that the big banks using obviously are looking for signs of synthetic audio to break through those barriers. So it really depends again on the application, but there's certainly a lot of innovation in the space and lots of really interesting tools that are being put in the hands of customers as well as the institutions themselves.
Brilliant, thank you. Anyone else want to come on this one quickly? We've got one other question and then we're getting close to time.
I would just say that it's an ongoing arms race. Deepfake data has tells, but the tells are different and they change depending on what model is being used to create the deepfake, and the tells becoming more subtle. So it's a bit like antivirus technology. Whatever you've got, it needs to be up to date. It's not a static. We've got that protection. It's something that will need to be continually updated. So your provider has to be, on the forefront.
Thank you. Final question here. What are some examples of where AI is underutilized and not getting enough attention right now? Are there any areas where, two questions actually, where AI shouldn't be used and why?
Shall I say something about that one? So I think the concern, I guess, from the government side of things and from what I've had conversations about, is where AI steps into decision making. And going from gathering patterns and presenting information to then going towards, taking an action, and making sure that is transparent and understandable and explainable. And I think if you get into a situation where that sort of closed system is doing its thing and no one can really explain it, and there's outcomes coming out, whether it be from my side in terms of you know, material that should help the defendant, for example, that you know, it's their legal right, but no human is really involved in that. Or from the detection side, maybe people getting, you know, transactions refused or whatever else, and there's no recourse to a human to explain it. For me, that's the kind of the red line that needs to be very, very carefully tiptoed up to. You know, it might be we get to a stage where decision making is more possible, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think there's not necessarily an appetite by regulators and the courts and things to countenance that.
Thank you, Gareth. We're unfortunately at time. Like to thank all of you on the panel. That was very, very interesting. I'm sure everyone found it as interesting and engaging as I did. If you have any further questions, then do reach out to us at the Payments Association, the email address at the bottom of the screen. You'll get a survey, so please do share your feedback. It's very important to us in shaping future events. There will be a recording in the next 48 hours. So all that remains on behalf of the Payments Association and all of our excellent speakers to thank you again for joining us, and hopefully we will see you at a future event. Have a good afternoon, everyone.